My ex's mother sneered. She's only here to humiliate herself. But as I walked into the courtroom behind my ex, the judge suddenly froze. He leaned toward the clerk, his voice shaking. Why didn't anyone tell me she was here? The silence that followed said it all. Can you imagine walking into a courtroom, facing the man who tried to destroy your life, only to see him smirk, surrounded by his powerful family? He truly believed he'd buried me, shattered my reputation, stolen the only family I had left. But then, suddenly, everything changed with just one quiet man's unexpected arrival and the judge's panicked whisper. Why didn't anyone tell me she was here? My ex-husband had no idea his carefully constructed empire of lies was about to come crashing down. That morning, I stood outside the courthouse, the October sunlight feeling far too bright for the storm brewing inside me. My hands were steady, though. I'd learned that stillness could be a weapon, that silence could scream louder than any shout. And then I saw him. Ethan Hale, my ex-husband, walked up those granite steps like he owned them, flanked by his silver-haired lawyer and his mother, Margaret, who wore pearls and an expression of smug certainty. Ethan's laugh, sharp and cruel, carried on the breeze, the same laugh I'd heard 1,000 times when he thought he'd won. He caught my eye, leaned toward his lawyer, his voice just loud enough for me to hear. Look at her. Pathetic. She actually thinks she has a chance. I didn't flinch. Not anymore. I'd stopped flinching 2 years ago. Because this wasn't just about our failed marriage or splitting assets or settling scores. No, this trial was about Leah, my 15-year-old sister. The girl I'd raised since our parents died when she was 7. The girl Ethan had tried to take from me by convincing a court I was mentally unstable, unfit, dangerous. He'd painted me as the villain, the obsessive ex-wife, the unstable woman who couldn't let go. But I'd been painting my own picture, stroke by careful stroke, for 3 agonizing years. And today, the canvas would finally be revealed. Inside my mind, I could still see Leah's face from that morning, hopeful and terrified all at once. Her dark hair pulled back, her hands gripping mine as she promised to be brave. I'd told her to stay home, to avoid the circus, but she'd insisted on being nearby, waiting at a cafe with my best friend, Ava. You can't protect me from everything, Clara, she'd said, and the raw truth of it had broken something in my chest. I'd been trying to protect her from Ethan since the day I realized what he truly was. Memories surfaced unbidden. Ethan during our marriage, all charm and calculated affection. He'd isolated me so gradually I hadn't noticed until I was completely alone. First, it was subtle suggestions about college friends, then questioning my need for a separate bank account, then insidious comments about my work, my decisions, my very thoughts, always delivered with that smile that made me doubt myself. When our parents died, and Leah came to live with us, I thought she might soften him. Instead, she became another tool for control. She needs stability, he'd said. Maybe you shouldn't work so late. Maybe you're not giving her enough attention. I doubted myself constantly, wondering if he was right, if I was failing Leah. It took 2 years to realize that doubt itself was his cruelest creation. Clara. Ava's voice, warm and steady, pulled me back. She stood beside me now, her brown eyes reassuring. As a paralegal, she knew courtrooms the way I knew blueprints. You ready? She asked softly. I nodded, but she saw through it. You have something they don't, she whispered. Truth. And him. My throat tightened. I knew who she meant. Edward Langston. Retired federal judge. The man who'd believed me when no one else would. He taught me that justice wasn't about volume, but precision. He'd promised to be here, watching from the gallery, a silent presence that would change everything. But I didn't say his name aloud. Not yet. We walked into the courthouse, through security, down the marble hallway that smelled of polish and old paper. Ethan's lawyer, Harrison Burke, stood near the courtroom doors, chest puffed out, speaking loudly to colleagues. Judge Weston always sides with families of reputation, he said, glancing our way with barely concealed contempt. This will be over before lunch. I kept my gaze low, my expression neutral. Let him think I was afraid. Let them all think I was the broken woman Ethan had described in his filings. I knew something they didn't. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavy, weighted with wood and formality. I took my seat beside Michael Trent, my attorney, a quiet man with sharp eyes and an understated demeanor often mistaken for timidity. That was his greatest advantage. The bailiff called the court to order, and Judge Daniel Weston entered. A man in his 60s, steel-gray hair, a reputation for strictness tempered by fairness. Or so everyone said. I'd done my research. Weston favored stability and wealth, often ruling for established families over struggling individuals. Ethan's side was counting on that. The proceedings began with Ethan's testimony. He sat in the witness box, looking earnest and wounded, his voice trembling at all the right moments as he described our marriage. I tried to help her, he said, eyes glistening. After her parents died, Clara changed. She became paranoid, accusatory. She disappeared for hours. I worried about Leia's safety, about what Clara might do during one of her episodes. That word made my jaw clench. There had been no episodes. There had been late nights gathering evidence, meeting with Edward, building the case that would free both Leia and myself from Ethan's web. His lawyer presented doctored photographs, me looking disheveled in one, angry in another. All taken out of context, presented as proof of instability. Emails I'd written were twisted, words cherry-picked to make me seem obsessive. The gallery murmured sympathetically. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, playing the concerned grandmother to perfection. I sat perfectly still, watching it all unfold. When Michael stood to cross-examine, he did something unexpected. He asked for a brief recess. Harrison Burke shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is stalling. But Judge Weston, perhaps sensing the unusual nature of Michael's request, allowed it. During the recess, Margaret leaned toward Harrison, her voice dripping disdain. What's she waiting for? A miracle? I turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. The words came out calm, quiet, certain. No. I'm waiting for him to arrive. The confusion on her face was almost worth 3 years of suffering. Almost. The black sedan pulled up outside the courthouse at exactly 10:43 a.m. I knew because I'd been watching the clock, counting down the minutes until Edward Langston would walk through those doors and change everything. Inside, the recess had ended, and Ethan was back on the stand, spinning his narrative with renewed confidence. He described a night I'd supposedly thrown dishes, how Leia had cowered in her room, terrified. It was complete fiction, but he told it with such conviction that I saw Judge Weston lean forward, concerned. I had no choice but to document everything, Ethan continued. For Leia's protection. I have videos, recordings, witnesses who can confirm Clara's erratic behavior. My stomach twisted, but I kept my face blank. Michael had warned me. Ethan would try to bury me in manufactured evidence, but I'd been preparing for 3 years. I knew how to breathe through the lies. Judge Weston listened intently, his expression grave. His reputation preceded him. Strict but fair, though I knew he tended to favor families with established wealth and social standing. The Hales fit that description perfectly. Old money, community ties, charitable foundations bearing their name. I was just Clara Monroe, the architect whose professional reputation was destroyed when Ethan framed me for his crimes. The unstable widow who couldn't hold her life together after tragedy. That was the story everyone knew. But stories I'd learned could be rewritten. Michael stood, adjusting his glasses. Your Honor, the defense would like to call an additional advisor to review the evidence before cross-examination. Harrison Burke exploded. That's highly irregular, Your Honor. The witness list was submitted weeks ago. This is ambush tactics. Judge Weston frowned, then nodded slowly. I'll allow it, but Mr. Trent, this is the only irregularity I'm permitting today. Understood, Your Honor. The courtroom doors opened. I didn't turn around immediately. I wanted to savor this moment, the last seconds before everything shifted. I could feel the change in the air, the the subtle tension that preceded revelation. Then I turned. Edward Langston walked down the center aisle with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent 30 years interpreting the law at its highest levels. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed, silver hair neatly trimmed. Nothing flashy, no dramatic entrance. He simply walked forward and took a seat directly behind me in the first row of the gallery. Harrison Burke frowned, studying him. He didn't recognize Edward. Why would he? Edward had been retired for 5 years, deliberately keeping a low profile. But Judge Weston recognized him. I watched Weston's face and saw the exact moment recognition hit. His hand, reaching for his water glass, froze mid-motion. His eyes widened fractionally. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak but couldn't. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he turned to his clerk and said, "Why didn't anyone tell me she was here?" The pronoun was wrong. He meant he, but the shock had rattled him. The clerk looked confused as murmurs rippled through the gallery. Edward simply sat, hands folded, and gave me the smallest nod, just the corner of his mouth lifting in something that might have been a smile. Margaret's smug expression had vanished. She leaned toward Ethan, whispering urgently, but he looked just as confused as everyone else. Only Judge Weston understood what Edward's presence meant. I'd met Edward 3 years ago, during the darkest period of my life. Ethan had just left, taking Leia, and filing papers that painted me as dangerous. My architectural license was under review because of discrepancies in projects I'd worked on, discrepancies Ethan had manufactured using my credentials to funnel money through fake construction contracts. I was drowning. Everyone thought I'd done it to myself. Edward, reviewing cases for a federal inquiry into construction fraud, found my name. He'd read my testimony, seen the timeline, recognized the pattern of financial abuse and gaslighting. He reached out through a mutual connection, met me at a coffee shop, and asked one question: "Do you want justice or do you want revenge?" I told him the truth. I want my sister back, and I want my name cleared. He studied me, then nodded. Then we'll build a case properly, quietly. And when the time comes, the truth will speak for itself. For 3 years, he guided me, teaching me how to gather evidence legally, how to document everything, how to be patient when every instinct screamed to act. He taught me that justice wasn't loud, it was deliberate. And now he was here, and Judge Weston knew everything was about to change. Ethan's confidence had faltered. He kept glancing back at Edward, trying to understand why the judge looked so unsettled. Harrison Burke cleared his throat. "Your Honor, may we continue?" Weston blinked, pulled himself together. Yes, of course, Mr. Hale. Please continue your testimony." But something had shifted. The judge's questions were sharper now, more probing. When Ethan described my supposed instability, Weston asked for specific dates, concrete examples, documentation beyond the photos and emails. Ethan stumbled, and I saw the first crack in his facade. Margaret leaned forward, her knuckles white against the gallery railing. She'd built her family's reputation on control and appearances, and she could feel that control slipping away. Michael caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod. The plan was unfolding exactly as we designed it. When Ethan finally stepped down, he walked past me and hissed under his breath, "Who is that man?" I looked up at him, my expression serene. So, it was a masterful performance. If I hadn't lived through the reality, Margaret's cold dismissal of my concerns, her active participation in isolating me, her gleeful reinforcement of every lie Ethan told, I might have believed it myself. Harrison called 2 more character witnesses, both friends of the Hale family, both describing me as unstable, jealous, vindictive. They painted a picture of a woman spiraling, unable to cope, turning her pain outward toward her innocent husband. I sat through it all, my hands folded, my breathing steady. Michael had prepared me. "They'll try to bury you in narrative," he'd said. "Let them, because every lie they tell gives us an opening." When the character witnesses finished, Judge Weston turned to Michael. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine?" "No, Your Honor," Michael replied. "But we would like to call Clara Monroe to make a statement." Harrison leaped up. "Objection. Ms. Monroe is the plaintiff. She can't simply make unstructured statements. I'll allow it, Weston interrupted, his eyes flicking to Edward. But keep it brief, Mr. Trent. I stood and walked to the witness box, my legs steady despite the pounding of my heart. I'd rehearsed this 100 times, but now, the weight of 3 years pressed down on me. I looked at Judge Weston, then at Ethan, then back at the judge. Your Honor, I'm not here to defend my character against accusations. My character will become clear through evidence. But I do have some questions I'd like answered, if the court permits. Weston frowned. This is unusual, Miss Monroe. But proceed. I turned to Ethan, who sat beside his lawyer, his expression guarded. Ethan, do you remember our trip to Montreal 3 years ago in April? His jaw tightened. What does that have to do with? Just answer the question, I said calm.
Yes.
We attended a charity gala. The Hale Foundation's annual fundraiser. You told me we'd raised over $200,000 that night for children's hospitals. That's correct. I nodded slowly. And, do you remember the donation that disappeared? The one from the Westbrook Group, $50,000 that was supposed to be deposited but never appeared in the foundation's accounts. Ethan's face went pale. Harrison Burke shot to his feet. Objection. This is completely outside the scope. It's directly relevant, Your Honor, Michael interjected smoothly, approaching the bench with a folder, handing copies to the judge and Harrison. I watched Ethan's face as his lawyer read the documents, saw the moment comprehension, and panic flashed across his features. Your Honor, Michael said quietly, what appears to be a simple charity gala was actually a front for financial fraud. The Westbrook donation, along with several others, was funneled through Ethan Hale's company and into an offshore account. The charity never saw a penny. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Weston's gavel cracked against the bench. Order. Order. Margaret had gone rigid, her face ashen. Ethan found his voice. This is ridiculous. Those documents they're falsified. She's making this up. But I could see he was rattled. His careful facade was cracking. We have bank records, email correspondence, and testimony from the Westbrook Group CFO confirming their donation was rerouted, Michael continued, his voice steady. We also have similar documentation for 3 other charitable events over the past 5 years. Edward, still seated behind me, passed another folder to Michael through the gap in the gallery railing. It was a smooth, practiced motion, barely noticeable. But Judge Weston saw it, and his eyes widened again. Michael opened the new folder. Your Honor, this is a sealed affidavit from the Federal Inquiry into Construction Fraud in the Northeastern District. It names Ethan Hale as a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. The courtroom exploded. Harrison was shouting objections. Margaret was on her feet. Ethan had gone completely white. Judge Weston's gavel came down repeatedly. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. When the chaos subsided, Weston looked at the affidavit, his hands visibly trembling. He glanced at Edward, then back at the document, and I saw the moment he realized the full scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a custody case. It was a fraud case, a corruption case, a web of lies stretching back years, and he was now presiding over its unraveling. We'll adjourn for the day, Weston announced, his voice strained. I need time to review these documents and determine how to proceed. Court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. As the gavel fell, Ethan pushed past his lawyer and cornered me in the aisle. His face was twisted with rage and fear. Who told you about this? He hissed. I looked up at him, feeling nothing but cold certainty. You should have treated honesty like an asset, Ethan. Instead, you invested everything in lies. And now, the market's crashed. He stared at me, speechless, then turned and stormed out. Margaret followed, her pearls clicking, muttering, "This isn't over. This isn't over." But her voice lacked conviction. I gathered my things slowly, aware of the stares from the gallery, the whispered conversations. Edward stood and placed a hand briefly on my shoulder, a moment of contact, a gesture of support, before walking out ahead of me. Outside, Ava was waiting, her eyes wide. Clara, what just happened in there? I managed a tired smile. The truth. Just a piece of it, but enough to make them afraid. And tomorrow? I looked back at the courthouse doors, thinking of Leah, thinking of 3 years of careful preparation, of all the nights I'd wanted to give up but hadn't. Tomorrow, I said, we finish what we started. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, the same one I'd moved into after Ethan left, and let myself remember. 3 years ago, I'd been someone different. Clara Hale, married to a man I thought I knew, working as a junior architect on a federal project, a new community center. I was so proud of that work, of the difference it would make. I had known Ethan was using my credentials. The memory surfaced with painful clarity. I'd been reviewing invoices one evening, routine oversight, when I noticed discrepancies. Materials ordered but never delivered. Contractors paid for work that didn't exist. The amounts were small at first, easy to dismiss as clerical errors, but they added up and they all traced back to my signature. When I confronted Ethan, he'd looked at me with such sincere confusion that I doubted myself immediately. Clara, sweetheart, you've been under so much stress. Are you sure you're reading those correctly? Maybe you should take a break from the project. But I couldn't let it go. I dug deeper, stayed late, followed the paper trail, and that's when I found it. False construction contracts, shell companies, money moving through channels designed to look legitimate, but existing only to funnel federal funds into private accounts. Ethan's accounts. When I tried to report it, he'd been ready. Somehow, he'd anticipated my discovery. Within days, the discrepancies were attributed to me. My credentials, my signatures, my supposed incompetence, or worse, my deliberate fraud. No one will believe you, Ethan had said, his voice calm and cold in our kitchen. It was the first time I'd seen the mask drop completely. I've been building this for 2 years, Clara. Every piece of evidence points to you. If you try to expose me, you'll only destroy yourself. And Leah, his smile had been cruel. Leah will be fine with me, where she'll be safe from her unstable, criminal sister. That was the moment I realized I was trapped. If I reported the fraud, I'd lose my career and potentially my freedom. If I stayed silent, Ethan would continue stealing, and I'd be complicit. So I did the only thing I could. I started gathering evidence of my own, quietly, carefully. And then Edward Langston had found me. I rolled over, looking at the photograph on my nightstand, Leah and me at her 8th grade graduation, both smiling. I'd raised her since she was 7. Through grief, adjustment, adolescence, she was my sister, but in every way that mattered, she was my daughter. I couldn't let Ethan take her. My phone buzzed. A text from Edward. Rest. Tomorrow requires clarity, not exhaustion. I smiled, despite myself. He'd become more than a mentor. He was the father figure I'd lost, the steady presence reminding me I wasn't alone. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse to find reporters everywhere. News had leaked that the Hale custody case involved federal fraud allegations. Cameras flashed, but I kept my expression neutral. Edward was waiting inside. This time, he spoke directly to me. "They'll try to corner you emotionally today, Clara," he said, his voice low. "Burke will paint you as vindictive, a woman scorned, seeking revenge through false accusations. Don't let them." "I won't." "And Clara," he met my eyes, "what you're doing here, it's not just about winning. It's about reclaiming yourself. Remember that." I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Ethan looked haggard, like he hadn't slept. Margaret sat beside him, her usual composure cracked, her eyes darting with something close to fear. Harrison Burke, however, looked energized. He thought he'd found an angle. When court convened, he wasted no time. "Your Honor, the defense moves to have Edward Langston's testimony, or rather, his presence and any documents he's provided, disqualified on grounds of personal bias." Michael stood immediately. "Mr. Langston hasn't testified, Your Honor. He's simply observing." "His mere presence is prejudicial," Harrison argued. "He has a clear personal relationship with Ms. Monroe, has been advising her for years, according to her own admission yesterday. and his former position as a federal judge creates an implicit bias in favor of her claims. Judge Weston rubbed his temples. I could see the conflict, professional respect for Edward warring with Burke's procedural concerns. Mr. Langston, Weston said finally, would you approach the bench? Edward walked forward with that same quiet authority. The two men spoke in low tones for several minutes. I watched Weston's expression shift from skepticism to something else, shame, perhaps, or recognition. When Edward returned to his seat, Weston announced, Mr. Langston's presence will be allowed. He has not testified and has provided documents through proper legal channels via Ms. Monroe's attorney. The objection is overruled. Harrison looked furious but sat down. What I didn't know then, what I wouldn't learn until later, was what Edward had said to Judge Weston in that moment. He'd asked Weston a simple question. Would you have treated her fairly if you'd known from the start who she was? And Weston, to his credit, had recognized the uncomfortable truth in that question. The day proceeded with testimony from forensic accountants who'd reviewed the Hale Foundation's records. The evidence was damning. Years of financial irregularities, vanished donations, money laundered through legitimate charitable work. Ethan tried to claim ignorance, but the email trail told a different story. Messages in his own words, directing transfers, discussing strategies to make the numbers work, coordinating with others involved. By midday, even Margaret looked defeated. Ethan arrived looking worse than yesterday. His suit was immaculate, but there were shadows under his eyes, and his confident swagger had been replaced by something tighter, more defensive. He avoided looking at me completely, which told me more than any confrontation could have. He was afraid. Margaret walked beside him, her face set in hard lines. Gone was the concerned grandmother act. Now she just looked angry, her jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping beneath her skin. Edward was already in the courtroom when I entered, seated in his usual spot. His presence had become a touchstone. Every time doubt crept in, I'd glance back and see him there, steady and certain. He gave me a small nod as I took my seat beside Michael. Ready? Michael asked quietly. I nodded. We'd spent last night preparing. Michael had explained that we were reaching the critical point where evidence would either coalesce into undeniable truth or fragment into reasonable doubt. They're going to fight hard today, he'd warned. Burke knows this is his last chance to control the narrative. Judge Weston entered, and I studied his face. He looked like he'd aged years in the past few days. There was a heaviness to his movements, a reluctance that hadn't been there at the start. He called the court to order, and Harrison Burke immediately requested to speak. Your Honor, the defense would like to reopen proceedings with a motion to dismiss the financial allegations as irrelevant to the custody matter at hand. Denied, Weston said so quickly that Burke blinked in surprise. The financial improprieties go directly to character and fitness as a guardian. Continue with your case, Mr. Burke. Burke's jaw tightened, but he nodded. When he stood, his tone was more aggressive than I'd heard before. Your Honor, what we're witnessing is a classic case of a vindictive woman using emotional manipulation and theatrical accusations to destroy a man's reputation. Clara Monroe is not here seeking justice. She's seeking revenge. The words hit like they were meant to, sharp and accusatory. I felt Ava tense beside me, but I kept my breathing steady. Ms. Monroe has spent 3 years building this elaborate conspiracy theory, working with, he gestured toward Edward, influential connections to manufacture evidence and objection. Michael's voice was calm but firm. Counsel is making unfounded accusations without evidence. If he has proof that any evidence was manufactured, he should present it. Sustained, Weston said. Mr. Burke, stick to provable facts. Burke's face flushed, but he pressed on. Then let's talk about facts. We'd like to submit new evidence, courtesy of a more thorough investigation into Ms. Monroe's activities over the past 3 years. My stomach dropped. What had they found? Burke approached the bench with a file, and Michael stood to review it. I watched my attorney's face, looking for any sign of concern, but his expression remained neutral. After a moment, Michael looked up. Your Honor, we'd also like to submit new evidence, audio recordings obtained legally through Mr. Langston's federal inquiry connections. He pulled a small device from his briefcase, and suddenly the courtroom fell silent with anticipation. These are recordings of phone conversations between Ethan Hale and several business associates discussing the creation of false documentation and witness coaching. Burke shot to his feet. Objection. Where did these recordings come from? How do we know they're authentic? They came from a federal wiretap authorized during the construction fraud investigation, Michael replied calmly. They've been authenticated by federal forensic analysts. I have their reports here. Weston held up a hand. I want both sets of evidence submitted for my review. We'll take a short recess while I examine them. As the judge disappeared, the courtroom erupted in frantic whispers. Ethan leaned toward Burke, speaking urgently, his face pale. Margaret had her hand on his arm, squeezing so hard her knuckles were white. I turned to look at Edward, and he mouthed 2 words, "Stay calm." The recess felt endless. Ava brought me water that I couldn't drink. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. Everything hinged on what happened next, whether the judge would allow the recordings, whether Burke's counter-evidence would undermine our case. When we reconvened 20 minutes later, Judge Weston looked grim. Mr. Burke's evidence consists of testimony from 3 individuals claiming Ms. Monroe contacted them seeking false testimony against Mr. Hale. However, he paused, his voice hardening. 2 of those individuals have financial ties to Hale Construction, and the 3rd is currently under investigation for perjury in an unrelated case. I'm excluding this evidence as unreliable. Burke's face went red. Your Honor, however, Weston continued, Mr. Trent's audio evidence has been authenticated. I'm allowing it to be presented. The courtroom exploded with noise.
Reporters in.
The gallery frantically took notes. Margaret looked like she might be sick. Michael played the first recording. Ethan's voice filled the courtroom, tinny but unmistakable. Just stick to what we discussed. Clara was erratic, unstable. You witnessed arguments. Keep it vague enough that she can't disprove specifics. Another voice, male, uncertain.
I don't know, Ethan.
If this comes out, it won't. Trust me, I've covered every angle. The second recording was worse. Ethan discussing how to massage financial records to hide the charitable fraud, mentioning me specifically. The best part is, even if Clara figures it out, she's already been discredited. No one will believe her. I watched Ethan as the recordings played. His face had gone from pale to ashen, and his hands were shaking. He looked like a man watching his entire world collapse, because it was. When the recordings ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Then Judge Weston spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Mr. Hale, would you care to explain these recordings? Ethan stood slowly, struggling to find his footing, to locate the charm and confidence that had always been his shield. Your Honor, those conversations, they're taken out of context. I was speaking hypothetically, discussing worst-case scenarios with. You were coaching witnesses to lie, Weston interrupted coldly. You were conspiring to commit perjury in my courtroom.
No.
Sit down, Mr. Hale. Ethan sat, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly defeated.
Burke tried to salvage something.
Your Honor, while these recordings are concerning, they don't change the fundamental question of custody, and they change everything, Mr. Burke, Weston said, cutting him off. They speak directly to your client's character, his honesty, and his fitness as a guardian. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been wound tight for 3 years. This was happening. The truth was finally breaking through. During the lunch recess, Ethan cornered me in the hallway outside the restrooms. His face was twisted with desperation and rage. You think you've won? He hissed. You think this is over? I met his eyes steadily. I think you built your lies like glass walls, Ethan, and they're cracking. Everything I did for us. The money, the opportunities. I was building a future. You were building a prison, I said quietly. And the only person you've trapped is yourself. He stared at me, and I saw the moment something broke in him. The last vestige of his self-delusion shattering. Then he turned and walked away, shoulders hunched, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. When the afternoon session began, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Even Burke seemed to have lost his fighting spirit, going through motions more than mounting a defense. Michael presented testimony from Colin Vance, Ethan's former business partner, who detailed the fraud scheme in devastating clarity: the charitable foundations, the construction contracts, the offshore accounts, all of it laid bare. Margaret sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her face. The family reputation she'd guarded so fiercely was being destroyed in real time. As the day drew to a close, Judge Weston announced, "We'll reconvene tomorrow for final arguments and my decision. Until then, court is adjourned." Outside, the October evening air felt crisp and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. Ava came to stand beside me. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "I keep waiting to feel vindicated, but mostly I just feel tired." "That's because you're not doing this for revenge," she said. "You're doing it for Leia. And for yourself." Edward approached. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Clara, you've already accomplished something remarkable. You refuse to let him erase you." I turned to him, to this man who'd given me the tools to rebuild myself. "Thank you. For everything." He smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "I didn't do anything except believe what was already true, that you were stronger than your circumstances." As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed. A text from Leia. "Is it over yet?" I typed back, *almost sweetheart. Almost. That night, I barely slept again. But this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from the strange, unfamiliar feeling of hope, fragile as glass, but growing stronger with every breath. I wouldn't learn about this until later, but Edward told me what happened that night. Judge Daniel Weston sat alone in his chambers long after everyone else had left. The building was silent. Weston pulled out old case files, going through years of decisions, looking for the one case that had haunted him since Clara Monroe walked into his courtroom. He found it, buried in a stack from 3 years ago, a preliminary complaint filed by Clara Brennan, my married name then, regarding financial discrepancies. The report was thorough, detailed, clearly written. Weston had dismissed it with barely a glance. "Insufficient evidence to warrant federal review," his notes read. He passed it back to the state level, where it disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. If he'd read it properly, if he'd paid attention to the patterns I had identified, the entire fraud scheme might have been stopped years ago. Leia might never have been taken from me. My reputation might never have been destroyed. And Weston would have to live with that knowledge. The next morning, the media presence had tripled. News vans lined the street, cameras everywhere. The Hale family scandal had become a full-blown spectacle. I kept my head down, ignored the shouted questions, and made my way inside. Edward was waiting in our usual spot. When I sat down beside Michael, I felt the weight of this final day settle over me. This was it. Today would determine everything. Ethan looked hollow when he entered, like someone had scooped out everything inside him and left only a shell. Margaret wasn't with him. I learned later she'd suffered a breakdown and was under sedation. Judge Weston entered, and I studied his face. Something was different. A set to his jaw, a clarity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Before we begin final arguments," he said, his voice formal, "I need to address something. Mr. Langston, would you approach the bench?" Edward stood. The two men spoke in low tones for several minutes. I saw Weston's expression shift through shame, resignation, determination. When Edward returned to his seat, Weston turned to the court. "I want to state for the record that I have a personal connection to this case that I was not initially aware of. 3 years ago, I reviewed a preliminary complaint filed by Ms. Monroe, then Ms. Brennan, regarding financial irregularities. I dismissed that complaint without proper investigation." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Burke looked stunned. "I have consulted with Mr. Langston and with the State Ethics Board," Weston continued. "And while there is no legal requirement for me to recuse myself, I want to acknowledge this conflict openly. My failure 3 years ago does not excuse itself, but I am committed."
You.
It was about refusing to be erased. 3 months later, I stood in a different courtroom, this time as a witness in Ethan's criminal trial. Federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using the evidence we'd gathered, plus additional findings. Ethan had aged dramatically. When I took the stand, he finally looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before: genuine remorse. "Ms. Monroe," the prosecutor said, "can you describe what happened when you first discovered the fraud?" I told the truth. All of it. The discovery, the gaslighting, the threats, the years of carefully building my case while pretending to be broken. When the defense attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, I just answered honestly, without emotion, and eventually he gave up. Ethan was convicted on 14 counts of fraud, perjury, and racketeering. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. Margaret Hale accepted a plea deal: 3 years probation and community service in exchange for testimony against her son's business partners. She'd lost everything. I heard she moved to Florida, too ashamed to show her face in our city. As for me, life slowly returned to something resembling normal. My architectural license was reinstated. I started taking freelance projects, slowly rebuilding my career. Leah thrived. She made new friends, joined the drama club, started talking about college. Watching her heal was the greatest reward. One afternoon, 6 months after the verdict, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Judge Daniel Weston stood in my doorway, looking uncertain. "Ms. Monroe, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Your Honor. Please come in." He sat across from my desk, and I could see the weight he still carried. "I wanted to apologize properly," he said, "in private, without the courtroom theatrics. What I did 3 years ago, dismissing your complaint, it was careless and arrogant. I thought I knew better, without even reading your evidence properly, and you paid the price for my laziness." "You've already apologized," I said gently. "Words in a courtroom aren't enough." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I've written a letter to the State Ethics Board recommending mandatory review procedures for all preliminary complaints. I've also endowed a legal fund in your name to help other people in situations like yours who need legal help but can't afford it." Tears sprang to my eyes. "Judge Weston." "Daniel," he said. "Please." "Daniel, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. Because that morning, when I saw Edward sitting behind you in my courtroom, I realized something. I'd been so focused on reputation and protocol that I'd forgotten what justice actually means. Edward reminded me." "You reminded me." "What did he say to you?" I asked. "That first morning, when you whispered, 'Why didn't anyone tell me she was here?'" Daniel smiled sadly. "When I saw Edward, I knew immediately that something important was happening. I dismissed a case connected to his federal inquiry years ago, your case, though I didn't realize it at the time. And I knew if Edward was there, it meant I'd made a terrible mistake. That's when I whispered to my clerk, confused about why no one had warned me. Of course, no one could have warned me, because I'd failed to make the connection myself." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You know what Edward told me during that first recess? He asked me one question: would you have treated her fairly if you'd known from the start who she was?" And the honest answer terrified me. I didn't know. I'd built my reputation on being fair, but I'd become lazy, complacent. You reminded me what's at stake every time I put on that robe. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, thinking about justice and redemption and second chances. That evening, I picked Leah up from drama rehearsal, and we drove home through the city lights. She chattered about her role in the spring play, and I listened, letting her happiness wash over me. When we got home, I found a small package on our doorstep. Inside was a brass plaque, beautifully engraved, with a note from Edward. "For your desk. Remember what you've proven. That truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be patient." The plaque read, "Justice isn't loud. It's deliberate." I carried it inside and placed it on my desk, where I could see it every day. A reminder of what I'd survived, what I'd fought for, and who I'd become. Leah appeared in the doorway of my office. "What's that?" "A reminder," I said, "that we're stronger than our circumstances." She came to stand beside me, reading the inscription. Then she hugged me tight. "I'm proud of you, Clara, for never giving up." "I'm proud of us," I corrected, "for surviving." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Ethan in prison, Margaret in exile, and the empire of lies that had crumbled. I thought about Judge Weston's apology, Edward's quiet mentorship, Michael's steady support. But mostly, I thought about the woman I'd been 3 years ago, drowning, desperate, doubted by everyone, including herself. And the woman I'd become, steady, certain, unbreakable. Ethan had tried to bury me. He tried to erase me from my own life, to paint me as crazy and broken and worthless. Instead, I'd built my own foundation, brick by brick, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, day by day. And when the time came to stand on it, it held. I'd learned that justice wasn't about being loud. It wasn't about revenge or anger or even vindication. It was about being deliberate, about telling the truth quietly, consistently, without wavering, about believing in yourself even when no one else did. And in the end, that quiet persistence had been stronger than all of Ethan's lies. I fell asleep that night with Leia safe in the room next door, with my name cleared and my career restored, with the brass plaque sitting on my desk and the weight of 3 years finally lifted from my shoulders. I fell asleep finally, truly, completely free. And in the morning, I would wake up and build something new. If you've ever been dismissed, doubted, or told your truth didn't matter, what did you build in the silence while they underestimated you? Tell me what you think. I really want to know.